Exploding onto the comedy scene in 1980 after completely stealing the comedy classic Caddyshack, Rodney Dangerfield has often been cited as one of the best and most well-known comedians of the late 20th century, and not to mention one heck of a late bloomer in terms of his career. But despite his widespread success as a comedian, most of the movies he made were generally considered to be duds. Whether it was from subpar scripts or desperately trying to make something inherently unfunny funny, Dangerfield's film career is certainly not one to be envied by most. But despite that, he still had his fair share of good, or at least decent, movies to his name, with the 1986 film Back to School usually considered to be his best starring role in a comedy. But that being said, there is another movie he starred in that isn't nearly as well known that's actually pretty good, and even downright funny despite its reputation as being only slightly better than most of Dangerfield's other movies. And today, I'd like to go over this particular movie and argue for why it doesn't have the reputation it deserves. And there will be spoilers for this movie ahead, so in case you don't want anything about it ruined, you might just want to be on the lookout. This will be the only spoiler warning I'll be giving out. Alright, so to cut right to the chase, the movie in question is Rodney Dangerfield's 1983 comedy Easy Money. The story of a lovable slob who indulges in many vices, such as drinking, smoking, gambling, and overeating, who has, shall we say, a rather frosty relationship with his extremely rich but ultra-conservative mother-in-law, as she doesn't approve of his behavior or personality at all. But said mother-in-law is killed in a plane crash, and a clause in her will states that he and his family will inherit her entire fortune if and only if he can keep from indulging in his vices for 1 year straight. And being that he has not only a wife, but 2 children to think about, Dangerfield pulls out all the stops to ensure that he stays true to the conditions of the will. It won't be easy, however, as he finds temptation all around him, especially in the form of his friends who are even worse than him, a brother-in-law who stands to gain everything from his failing, and his own floundering willpower. And as all of this is going on, there's also a subplot involving one of his daughters, played by a very young Jennifer Jason Leigh, getting married and then falling out with her new husband, who then tries to win her back in comical ways that never seem to work out. Now, let me just say, there's a lot to like about this movie. I mean, it's not the funniest comedy ever, and is a bit awkwardly edited, but on the whole it is actually pretty funny. The premise allows for many comedic situations, and Dangerfield proves to be right in his element as a loving family man who has to try with everything he has to rein his vices in for the sake of everyone he cares about. He even proves to be surprisingly good in his character's more serious moments, such as his speech on how he loves his children, even if it does lead to one of the funnier gags in the movie, his complete breakdown after the pressure becomes too much for him, and the surprisingly tender moment where he has to break the news to his wife that her mother died. Because instead of getting up and dancing around after acting sympathetic for a few moments like you would expect from a comedy like this, he actually tells her very gently and comforts her, clearly feeling nothing but sorry for her. Honestly, if you thought Dangerfield could only play obnoxious, happy-go-lucky type characters, this movie would prove you dead wrong, as one is inclined to feel nothing but sympathy for him for most of the runtime, even if you also find yourself laughing at his misfortune quite often. And on that topic, the other characters also work just as well and provide their fair share of funny moments. But one that must be given a special mention is Joe Pesci. Playing Dangerfield's best friend in his first foray into comedy, Pesci proves to be an absolute natural and a complete scene stealer, with some critics even saying that he was the saving grace of the whole thing. And while I wouldn't exactly take it that far, I will say that Pesci most definitely nails each and every joke that's handed to him. Especially because, being even worse than Dangerfield, his attempts to comfort him usually don't end up working out so well, even if he does mean well. And that's another thing this movie does an excellent job at. It manages to portray people as flawed with vices they can't exactly keep under control, but always keeps them completely sympathetic, which is something that not every comedy is capable of pulling off. And another character that must also be mentioned is Julio. Played by Taylor Negron, Julio is a Spanish lover if there ever was one. Only his attempts to charm his new wife on their wedding night don't go as smoothly as he had planned. And honestly, as I touched on before, his attempts to win her back after she leaves him have got to be some of the funniest moments in the movie. But the most hilarious has to go to the bush scene. On his cousin's insistence, the two try to imitate Cyrano, only for things to quickly go off the rails because said cousin actually has no idea what he's doing. And once again, the results are absolute comedy gold. And there's also how he ultimately does end up winning her back by accidentally shooting her father in the behind. And after that, he ends up with a lot more than he bargained for, but in a way that most men would envy at that. And on that topic, Jennifer Jason Leigh plays her part just as well, perfectly selling her character as a hopeless romantic afraid of sex for comical reasons. Simply put, Leigh knows exactly the kind of movie she's in and plays her role to perfect effect. But on the flip side, one criticism the movie usually faces is that it underutilizes its potential villain, with that being Dangerfield's brother-in-law Clive Burrow, played by Jeffrey Jones. Because as I said before, he stands to gain the entire fortune if Dangerfield breaks the clause, but in the end actually doesn't do much to try and sabotage him. Though, granted, when he finally does try, the attempt would have worked had it not been for Julio accidentally sending him to the hospital. But while I do agree that his setup as the bad guy can end up being somewhat underwhelming, I think the movie was better off focusing for the most part on Dangerfield and his desperate desire not to succumb to the many temptations around him, and only bringing Clive into the picture once he's almost at his breaking point. Now, obviously, having him be a more hands-on villain could have worked, but the point is that the movie still manages to tell its story and be pretty funny in doing so, while ultimately keeping his role on the smaller side. Now, in the end, like I said before, Easy Money is most definitely not the funniest movie ever, but it is still a lot better than most seem to give it credit for, at least in my opinion. The humor isn't nearly as lowbrow as one would expect, has an interesting premise that is just rife for comedic potential, has plenty of genuinely funny, or even outright hysterical, moments throughout, has good character dynamics, is able to keep the sympathetic characters firmly sympathetic, and is overall just nice to watch. Because as Julio himself perfectly puts it, it has a very happy ending. Again, it may not be a masterpiece, and the types of humor it indulges in might not be for everybody, but in the end it still does its job of being exactly what it set out to be. Just a funny, feel-good piece of entertainment. And really, what more could you honestly ask for from a movie like this? Okay, That's everything I wanted to say. So now I'd like you guys to tell me, do you believe that Easy Money might just be one of Rodney Dangerfield's most underrated movies and a genuinely funny movie? Or do you believe it's nothing but a childish, humorous mess? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And please keep in mind, you don't have to agree with me or this video just because you watched it. If you think Easy Money is the worst comedy ever made and I've got it all completely wrong, you're most definitely free to feel that way. And thank you all for watching. It is very greatly appreciated. And I hope to see you all next time.